It begins in silence. A dorm room in Harvard, the faint glow of a monitor cutting through the stale air of a late-night winter. A young man, pale from hours indoors, leans over his keyboard with the rigid posture of someone not searching for rest, but for release. His fingers move fast, but not with ease. Each keystroke carries weight, as if pressing against the world itself. His name is Mark, and at this moment, no one knows him. He is faceless, invisible, yet burdened by an obsession too sharp to hide. He wasn't born into power, not into hunger either, not in the way of true poverty. But there was a hollowness in him, an itch that ordinary comfort could never soothe. Others in his world smiled easily, laughed easily. He didn't. For Mark, every interaction was measured, every word processed like code. He saw people, but he didn't belong to them. He was a spectator to the rituals of human connection, standing just outside the circle of warmth. And in that distance, a question kept echoing. What if I could build the circle myself? In classrooms, he was brilliant but restless. Teachers admired his mind, but not his silence. Friends respected his talent, but feared his detachment. He was the boy who could write a program in one night that others would take months to imagine. Yet what he craved wasn't recognition. It was proof. Proof that he wasn't meant to fade into the background, that his silence was not emptiness, but a waiting storm. It started with small acts, seeds planted in shadows. Programs that compared student faces, games that unsettled administrators, codes that spread faster than rules could contain. Every step carried whispers of disapproval, warnings of failure, hints that he was crossing invisible lines. But the thrill of crossing them was stronger than the fear. Mark discovered something dangerous in himself. He didn't just want to create, he wanted to control. One night, when the dorm halls were dead quiet and the only sound was the low hum of servers, he realized the depth of his hunger. It wasn't about games or experiments anymore. It was about people, the messy, fragile networks of trust, affection, envy, and desire. He wanted to capture them, map them, reduce them into something he could see, touch, manipulate. A digital mirror of the human soul. Something no one else dared to build. But to chase that dream meant risk. Harvard was not a place of forgiveness. Already he had drawn ire for his reckless projects. He knew the ridicule that followed, the scorn of professors, the disgust of peers. He could feel the walls pressing in. Stay small, play safe, blend in. Yet blending in was death to him. So he chose differently. The decision came like a knife in the dark. He would build a platform, a network where every student, every stranger, could lay bare their identity, no permission asked, no apologies given. He called it the Facebook. The first nights were a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. He coded until his eyes burned, until his fingers ached, until time itself lost meaning. There was no team yet, no investors, no grand office. Just a dim dorm room and an obsession gnawing through the hours. He knew the odds. Most projects like this died unseen. He had no guarantee, but he couldn't stop. Something in him whispered that this wasn't just another experiment. This was the fracture point of his life. When he finally released it to the campus, he braced for silence. He knew rejection well enough to expect it, but what came was different. Curiosity first, then a spark, then wildfire. Within days, students were talking about it in hallways, logging in late at night, refreshing pages as if they held pieces of their own reflection. His dorm became a shrine of whispered rumors and glowing screens. But victory never comes clean. With attention came conflict. Accusations that he had stolen the idea, betrayal from classmates who claimed ownership of the concept, anger from those who saw in his work not genius but theft. He was dragged into arguments, into heated rooms where older, louder voices tried to dismantle him. For a moment, the walls trembled again. The dream threatened to collapse under the weight of lawsuits, threats, shame. And yet, he didn't flinch. He didn't crumble. He pressed forward, unblinking, even as friends turned into enemies, and the world began to fracture around him. Inside, he felt a cold clarity. He wasn't building for them, not anymore. He was building for the vision itself. Still, the first real test was not the lawsuits, nor the envy, nor the threats. It was the silence that followed his initial triumph. The terrifying question: could this thing live outside Harvard's gates? Or would it die like every other student project, remembered only as a brief distraction in an endless cycle of ideas? He risked everything on the answer. He dropped the safety of Harvard, left behind the prestige of the world's most envied institution, walked away from the promise of certainty. He and a few allies fled to a rented house in Palo Alto, where the air was thick with heat and the nights were suffocatingly quiet. There, stripped of protection, he sat again before his monitor. Not a student anymore, but a fugitive from normal life. And in that fragile, uncertain summer, the silence pressed harder than ever. They were running out of money, eating cheap meals, sleeping on floors, staring at the screen with bloodshot eyes, as if the code itself could answer their fear. Some nights, Mark felt it clawing at him, that sinking dread that maybe it had all been a mistake, that maybe he had gambled too soon, too recklessly, that maybe the fire would burn out and leave only ashes. But the platform grew, slowly at first, like an ember fighting the wind, then steadily, then violently. Colleges outside Harvard began to join. The map expanded. The walls cracked. The small experiment that had been born in silence began to roar. And one night, Mark looked at the glowing numbers on his screen, the surge of sign-ups, the avalanche of profiles, and realized something terrifying. The dream was no longer his alone. It was consuming him, consuming everyone around him. He had opened a door that would never close again. He sat back, staring at the screen, and felt both triumph and dread in equal measure. This was what he had wanted, to capture the human circle, to hold it in his hands. But in holding it, he understood the cost. There would be no return, no escape. And in that suffocating room in Palo Alto, with the world outside still unaware of what was coming, Mark Zuckerberg took his first fragile step into infamy. The walls of the rented house in Palo Alto grew tighter with every passing week. Screens glowed day and night, their blue light carving shadows across exhausted faces. The small team worked like ghosts, bound together not by comfort, but by desperation. Mark rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried a weight that silenced the room. They trusted him, or perhaps they feared him. It was hard to tell the difference. The money was thinning. Their savings were almost gone. Each day felt like a wager with fate, every meal another reminder that success had not yet arrived. Failure hung in the air, invisible but heavy, pressing down on their shoulders. The neighbors saw only a group of kids playing with computers, but inside, the tension was suffocating. If the numbers didn't rise, if the users didn't multiply, all of it would end not with fire, but with silence. And then came the knock at the door. It was the first investor, the first sign that someone outside their fragile circle believed. A man who looked past the clutter, past the stale air and sleepless eyes, and saw something worth risking money on. The offer wasn't salvation, not yet, but it was oxygen. Enough to keep them alive. Enough to keep Mark's obsession from collapsing into dust. Still, victory tasted bitter. With the money came expectations, scrutiny, pressure. The whispers of betrayal followed him from Harvard lawsuits, accusations, classmates turned enemies. They claimed he had stolen the idea, that he wasn't a visionary, but a thief. Every article, every headline dug deeper into the wound. Mark stood in meetings, listening to older men challenge him, corner him, question him, and something inside him froze. He wouldn't apologize. He wouldn't yield. To admit fault was to dismantle the fragile tower he had built. So he wore his silence like armor. The platform spread like wildfire, leaping from campus to campus, city to city. The growth was relentless, uncontrollable. But with every new user, the shadows around Mark deepened. He was no longer a boy building in secret. He was becoming a figure of suspicion, of power, of ambition, too large to contain. Friends who had once shared his vision began to look at him differently, as if they couldn't tell whether he was a partner or a rival. Trust, once fragile, shattered easily in the heat of success. One by one, bonds began to break. Eduardo, the friend who had once believed most in him, now stood at a distance, cut out of decisions, frozen by the cold strategy that Mark wielded like a blade. Their brotherhood dissolved under the weight of contracts, shares, and signatures written in ink that smelled of betrayal. Mark didn't look back. He told himself it was necessary, that sacrifice was the price of survival. But in the silence of late nights, when the screens dimmed and the world outside was asleep, he felt the ghost of that friendship pressing against him. Power came quickly after that. Offices replaced dorm rooms. Investors replaced classmates. Lawyers replaced friends. The boy who once coded alone in the dark was now surrounded by armies of advisors, yet lonelier than ever. Every decision carved a deeper line between him and the world. Every step forward left another body behind. And then came the first true victory, a moment when the world outside could no longer ignore him. A contract signed, a valuation whispered in rooms of glass and steel, the declaration that the Facebook was not just a project, but a company. Mark sat at the head of the table, barely 20 years old, watching men decades older lean toward him with cautious respect. He should have felt triumph. Instead, he felt the weight of inevitability. Because with that victory came the truth. There was no turning back. The wheel was in motion, faster than he could control, heavier than he could stop. The network wasn't just a reflection of students anymore. It was becoming the bloodstream of the internet itself, a living organism feeding on secrets, relationships, desires. He had captured the circle, but the circle was expanding beyond his reach. Some nights he stared at the screen, scrolling endlessly through the profiles of strangers. Millions of faces, each reduced to lines of data, each part of the machine he had unleashed. And he wondered not with fear, but with a cold, gnawing fascination, what it meant to hold so many lives in his hands. The lawsuits dragged on. The betrayals deepened. The victories multiplied. Mark walked through it all with the same unblinking stare. To some, he was ruthless. To others, brilliant. To most, a mystery. He spoke little, revealed less, but behind the silence was a truth he carried like a scar. The dream had devoured him long before it devoured the world. The first 1,000,000 users came, then 10 million, then more. Each milestone was celebrated with cheers, with champagne, with headlines. But for Mark, it was never enough. The numbers blurred, the victories hollowed, the silence grew louder. No matter how far the platform spread, he remained the boy in the dorm room, pressing against the keys with restless fingers, chasing a circle that would never close. Years later, when the company's name would echo in every corner of the world, when his face would appear on covers, when power itself would bend to his creation, he would still return to that question. What if I had stopped? What if I had chosen differently? But he hadn't. He couldn't. The path was carved in code, written in obsession, etched in betrayal. The boy who wanted to belong had built a world where everyone belonged, and yet he remained alone, staring through the glass at the very circle he had created. And that is the story of the first step. Not the billions that came after, not the empire that consumed nations, but the fragile moment when one boy in a dorm room chose obsession over silence, risk over safety, betrayal over friendship. The moment that set everything in motion. The world would come to see him as a genius, a villain, a visionary, a thief. But Mark knew the truth. He was simply a boy who couldn't stand the silence. A boy who chose to build a mirror for humanity, only to find his own reflection staring back at him in the dark. And in that reflection, the question never disappeared. The doubt never faded. The scar never healed. What if he had stopped? What if he had never pressed those keys? The silence holds the answer, and the silence never lets him go.